It sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? This woman comes to Jesus in a moment of great need, and it's not like it's selfish or motivated by something only for herself. She's worried about her daughter who's being tormented by evil, and she appeals to Jesus, and Jesus' response looks to be, first of all, dismissive and then even insulting. He says, I was only called to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then when she pleads with him further, he says, look, dogs shouldn't get to eat the food that's for the children. It's kind of jarring, isn't it, in our picture of Jesus? It's shocking to hear Jesus speaking like this. What's going on here? What's happening in the story? One way, and I think this goes to the very heart of understanding what's happening, is to take the first reading from today and the gospel, which are always linked on a Sunday. There's always a thematic link between the first reading and the gospel every week. This week, I think it's really important that we take the first reading as prophecy and the gospel as fulfillment of that prophecy. Okay? So in order to really understand what's happening in the gospel, as I've often said, we've really got to make sure we understand what's happening, not just in the reading from the prophet Isaiah in the first reading, but actually from the Old Testament as a whole. But this passage from the first reading gives us a window and insight into that moment. What we're told in the first reading is that it says foreigners, or another word might be the nations. It gets translated different ways. But the key idea here is that people who aren't Jews are going to come to the mountain of the Lord, that's Mount Zion, and the city of the Lord that's built on Mount Zion is Jerusalem. And then as the passage goes on, it says that they will make offerings on my altar, which of course happens in the temple. And it says, the passage continues and concludes with, my house, says God, will be a house of prayer. Well, the house is the temple. The thing that's striking about this image is that the temple, in the time that Isaiah's writing, and it had been for the best part of 1,000 or 500 years beforehand, is that the temple is for the Jews. The temple is the God of Israel's home and dwelling, and the other peoples, the other nations, well, they have their own deities, their own gods. But the vision of God that Israel receives and the vision of what God's doing in the world is that, yes, God has chosen Israel to be his people, but that he has also then called them through them, he will bring salvation to the rest of the world. And so we hear that passage of all of the nations coming to Jerusalem and to the temple of God, and it sounds really natural to us, but that's because we read it with a very Christian lens. What we need to read it with is actually kind of a Jewish lens, if you like. The Jewish people understood themselves to be called by God in a special way, but never just for themselves. It was God had chosen them in order to bring about his purpose and redemption, his plan for the whole world through them. That everybody would come and worship God, but that would happen in and through his calling of Israel. So in that case, when we think about that passage, what happens in the gospel makes perfect sense when we recognize how Jewish Jesus is. Because as Jesus understands what he's been called to do, as he understands his vocation, what his mission is, he recognizes that his first task is to fulfill what God has been doing with Israel, and then through that out to the nations, out to the rest of the world. That's why it looks like he's dismissing this woman, because for Jesus, and I think that there's lots of evidence in the gospel for this, he understands the fulfillment of his purpose and plan to take place after his death. That the rest of the world will come, all the other nations will come and worship the God that he called Father, the God of Israel, in and through and because of his death and his resurrection. what strikes us here, I think, and sorry, let me back up a step. If you want a little bit of just a piece of how that comes to be true, how that plays out, if you look at the Gospels, again and again, non-Jewish men and women come to Jesus, and he's always struck by their faith. He goes to non-Jewish territories, but really the fullness of the mission towards those people comes after his death and resurrection. And the key moment in that is that at the moment of his death, the first person to profess him as the Son of God is not a Jew. It's the Roman centurion, of course, who watches as Jesus dies. So this Canaanite woman, this woman who is not a Jew, is part of that story. It's this glimpse in the Gospels we get that this is supposed to go out to the whole of the world, but in and through what God is doing with the Jewish people. If that's the case, then we want to think for a moment, I think, about the fulfillment of that passage in Isaiah in the church. That the church is called to be a place, a worshipping community, a house of prayer for all peoples. And so that's really crucial for all of us, because unless you're Jewish and you've become a Catholic, then you and as am I, we are all kind of like the Canaanite woman. We stand in, if you like, in a lineage to her, because we're Gentiles, we're non-Jews. And so we can look to her as an example of faith. Her humility, her persistence, her faith can be a great example to us. But I think there's something also important going on that I want to draw your attention to, which is that at the very core of the early church, at the very heart, therefore, of Christian faith, the church is to be a multi-ethnic community, a multicultural community. We see this at Pentecost really clearly, when there are people of different nations who gather for the Feast of Pentecost and they experience the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. At the very birth of the church, in other words, we see a multicultural reality. The early Christians understood, as they watched God at work in the non-Jewish population, in the Gentile population, as they saw God doing something with them that was the same as what had happened with them as Jews, they realized that what Jesus was coming to do was to reconcile and restore relationships between all peoples, Gentile and Jew alike, non-Jew and Jew, in other words. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and it goes right to the very heart of our faith. And so I think that what we want to recognise and celebrate here then is that at St Declan's we are very much that kind of a community. In our vision, the vision statement that we have, we talk about wanting to be a community that celebrates our cultural diversity. Not just because that's a nice thing and isn't it lovely for us all to kind of hold hands and be friends together, no holding hands in COVID, but you know what I mean by the image. It's not because of that, because that's a nice thing, it's because the gospel requires it of us. It's because we're Christians that we're called to walk together even when we come from all sorts of different places, and especially because we come from all sorts of different places. Now I come back to Pentecost again for a moment. You see, one of the crucial things about Pentecost was it didn't erase, the coming of the Holy Spirit didn't erase different people's cultural backgrounds, but the church was challenged and encouraged to find a unity that embraced the diversity, that could hold the diversity of all the peoples that were gathered. This, another way of putting all of this, is it goes right to the heart of the word Catholic, because that means universal. Here at St Declan's, we have a really, I think, a really wonderful gift and opportunity. I remember at my installation as parish priest several years ago, we had a big multicultural lunch down in Fernlands Hall, and I've been trying to find the figures, because I kept track of how many different, everyone brought something, and we asked them to bring something from their country of origin, and I've got 100 different countries in my head as the figure. And it might be wrong, it might be a little less than that. But it's certainly, we've got an extraordinary number of people whose original home, whether it's their parents, themselves, or their grandparents, that a key part of their cultural identity is from somewhere other than Australia. Of course, there's a sense that with the exception of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we're all migrants, really. What I think here that we have is we have a wonderful gift because we have this great diversity that, remember, goes to the very heart of the gospel, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to be able to offer something. In some ways, Australia is very successful in negotiating the diverse mix of peoples, but there's something really important about the church being a clear sign of the unity that's possible in the midst of our diversity, of a way of welcoming people from all sorts of different places, and here's the key thing, in a mysterious way finding this place to be home. If you've made your home here in Australia, it's home, but of course home's a complicated thing. If you also have strong ties with somewhere else, if you're a recent immigrant or your parents were, even your grandparents were, then there's a sense in which you have more than one home. That home's a complicated kind of notion. It's my hope and prayer that as far as our spiritual home might be, that's something that at St Declan's people would say that not despite my cultural identity, but in the midst of my cultural identity, I find this to be a spiritual home. This is a place of prayer for all peoples. This is a fulfillment, in a small way, of what it says in the first reading, that this will be a place where all peoples can gather and worship God in prayer. This will be a place where we find that who I am and our cultural identity is crucial to who we are, is not dismissed, certainly not denigrated, but is actually celebrated, but that we also find that unity in the midst of our diversity because we're able to call this place our spiritual home. Why and how? Because like the Samaritan woman, what we're united by is our faith, and in a very real way, our persistence that calls upon Jesus to recognise all of our need for salvation, that all of us need to know the love and the mercy of God. Jesus dies on the cross to destroy the enmity between peoples, and the church is intended to be a clear sign of that unity, of that reconciliation between peoples. May this always be true here at St Declan's.